42 minutes past 3 in the afternoon, Sunday, the 6th of March, 1988. Winston Churchill Avenue, Gibraltar. A man and a woman are walking north toward the border. 40 yards behind them, on the same pavement, a third man is walking in the same direction. None of the three are armed. None of the three are carrying a bomb. The car they park near the assembly area contains no explosives. The actual bomb, 64 kilograms of Semtex loaded into a red Ford Fiesta, is sitting in a parking lot in Marbella, 50 miles up the Spanish coast. None of the three know they are about to die. None of the four men following them on the same pavement, in plain clothes, with concealed Browning high-power 9mm, know that the operation they are conducting will, 7 years later, be ruled unlawful by the European Court of Human Rights. The first time a Western democracy is found to have killed its own citizens in violation of the Convention. The shooting begins within seconds. This isn't primarily a story about those seconds. It's a story about the months of decisions that made them inevitable, and the 7 years of legal reckoning that followed. The shooting on Winston Churchill Avenue was the outcome of a planning chain that had been assembling link by link since the previous November. Understanding what broke requires understanding what it was built to do. From late November 1987, British intelligence had established that several known IRA members were travelling from Belfast to Spain under false identities. MI5 and Spanish security services placed the emerging active service unit under surveillance along the Costa del Sol. The three core members they identified were Daniel McCann, Sean Savage and Mairead Farrell. Journalist Brendan O'Brien later described them as three of the IRA's most senior activists. McCann was a high-ranking intelligence operative. Savage was an explosives expert. Farrell had served as officer commanding the IRA women's prisoners in Armagh jail before her release in 1986, after 10 years during which she had led no-wash protests and an 18-day hunger strike against the withdrawal of political prisoner status. Both McCann and Farrell had previously served prison sentences for explosives offences. None of the three were improvising. The target was Gibraltar. Specifically, the weekly changing of the guard ceremony at the convent, the governor's residence, where, every Tuesday at 11 in the morning, the soldiers of the Royal Anglian Regiment assembled in a car park before the formal ceremony began. The Anglians had recently been transferred from service in Northern Ireland. The IRA calculated that a car bomb detonated in the assembly area while it was full of soldiers would kill dozens, perhaps scores. Several schools and an old people's home were close by. Gibraltar was also a symbolic target in its own right. British sovereign territory, accessible from Spain by road, with a publicly advertised military ceremony that repeated every 7 days without variation. A known IRA member had been spotted watching the ceremony as early as late 1987. The reconnaissance was systematic. Surveillance photographs taken by British intelligence would later reveal that a Sinn Féin official named Siobhan O'Hanlon had attended the ceremony on multiple visits before noticing Spanish surveillance and returning to Northern Ireland. The operational plan had a specific architectural problem. The car park on a Tuesday morning would be busy. To guarantee a parking space for the bomb vehicle, the team needed to occupy the spot in advance and hold it overnight. The plan was to drive a clean car into the space the day before and simply wait, then swap it for the actual bomb vehicle on the morning of the attack. This was the job Sean Savage drove to Gibraltar to perform on the morning of Sunday the 6th of March. To park a white Renault 5 near the assembly area, hold the space through Sunday night, and make way for the real vehicle before 11 in the morning on Tuesday the 8th. The actual bomb wasn't with him. The red Ford Fiesta in the Marbella car park contained 141 pounds of Czech-manufactured Semtex, approximately 64 kilograms, surrounded by 200 rounds of ammunition, with 4 detonators and 2 timers. A timing device inside had been preset for 11:20 in the morning, 20 minutes after the ceremony was due to start. The bomb was real, it was ready, and it had never been brought to Gibraltar. McCann, Savage and Farrell had each travelled independently to Malaga, where they rented cars and established a base of operations on the Costa del Sol. They moved separately, met rarely, communicated carefully. The Spanish security services running surveillance on them described a multi-vehicle operation, cars leapfrogging each other on Spanish roads to avoid detection, a helicopter overhead, fixed observation posts, constant radio communication between the tracking officers and their headquarters. British intelligence was kept continuously briefed on the unit's movements. By early March, the planned attack date had been confirmed, Tuesday, the 8th of March, 1988. In Gibraltar, the local authorities had been running their own quiet countermeasure. In December 1987, they suspended the changing of the guard ceremony, citing a need to repaint the guardhouse. They wanted to establish whether the IRA's reconnaissance interest would continue without an active ceremony to watch. It did. An IRA member reappeared at the same location in February 1988, inspecting an area where no ceremony was occurring. That confirmed it. By early March, an advisory group chaired by Commissioner Canepa, with members drawn from MI5, the British military, and Gibraltar police, had determined that an attack was imminent. 16 SAS operators were dispatched to Gibraltar by the 3rd of March, apparently with the personal approval of Margaret Thatcher. Before deployment, they had practiced arrest techniques. Gibraltar's authorities had identified a suitable holding facility for detainees after arrest. The formal plan was to take the unit into custody once they were observed parking a car and attempting to leave the territory. The arrest option was built into the plan in principle. What the plan lacked was any functional mechanism for achieving it if the scenario departed from the expected sequence. The belief that ultimately pushed the 4 SAS soldiers toward lethal force had its origin in a January 1988 discovery in Belgium. Belgian police had found an IRA vehicle containing Semtex, detonators and equipment for a radio-controlled detonation device. An MI5 officer, identified in proceedings only as Mr. O, briefed the advisory group on this discovery and on the possibility that the Gibraltar operation might use a similar setup, a bomb that could be triggered remotely by someone pressing a button on a handheld transmitter. Intelligence officers used a specific phrase for this. They called it a button job. The operational implication was direct. If one of the 3 was carrying such a device, any hand movement toward a pocket or a bag in a crowded public space, while potentially standing within radio range of 64 kilograms of explosive, could detonate it in under a second. The January briefing established this as a live possibility. By March, inside the operational planning, it had shifted toward a working assumption. Spanish security services lost track of McCann, Farrell and Savage before they entered Gibraltar. The surveillance that had been comprehensive for months simply failed at the border crossing on the morning of the 6th. British and Gibraltar authorities didn't have continuous coverage of what the unit was carrying when they crossed onto British territory. Savage drove the white Renault 5 across the airport causeway checkpoint at 12:45. The road bisects the runway. Traffic lights hold drivers at the crossing while planes land and depart over their heads. He cleared the checkpoint and drove into the town, parking near the assembly area roughly 10 minutes later. An MI5 officer on the ground recognized him, but couldn't make a positive identification for almost 90 minutes. During that 90 minutes, Savage parked the car, spent time making adjustments inside the vehicle, according to the Foreign Secretary's later common statement, and then walked away from it. McCann and Farrell crossed the border on foot at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon. The three met in the car park at around 2:50. They stood together briefly. They looked toward where the Renault was parked. They talked. Then they began walking north toward the border. Once the three left the car park, Soldier G, a bomb disposal officer attached to the operation, moved to inspect the Renault. He walked past it slowly, doing what bomb disposal officers do when they can't open a vehicle, reading the exterior for indicators. He looked at the antenna configuration. He looked at the height of the bodywork over the wheels, checking whether the springs were compressed under heavy weight. He looked for visible wiring. He found no definitive indicators. But Semtex, properly packed into a vehicle in a concealed configuration, might not compress the springs enough to be visible from a walk past. He couldn't open the car. He reported back that it should be treated as a possible car bomb. His professional assessment of uncertainty, the technical language of someone who can't confirm either way, was then conveyed to soldiers A, B, C and D, not as uncertainty, but as near certainty. The car probably contained a bomb. One of the three walking north toward the border might be holding the trigger. At 15:40, not 3 in the afternoon, but 40 minutes past, Commissioner Canepa formally signed operational control over to the SAS's senior officer, identified in proceedings as Soldier F. A written transfer document records the moment. 2 minutes later, the 4 soldiers moved to intercept the 3 people walking north on Winston Churchill Avenue. The avenue is the main road through Gibraltar, running north from the town toward the border and the airport. It's wide, commercially busy, flanked by petrol stations and low-rise buildings. On a Sunday afternoon in early March, the sun is lower than a summer visitor might expect, but still bright enough to cast hard shadows. The Shell petrol station on the western side of the road sits at a junction of sight lines from several apartment blocks above. The 3 IRA members were walking on the pavement in front of it when the siren went off. The siren had nothing to do with the operation. Inspector Louis Revagliate and 3 uniformed officers were stuck in heavy northbound traffic on Smith Dorian Avenue, urgently recalled to police headquarters. Revagliate's driver activated the siren to push through the congestion, pulling the car onto the wrong side of the road to reach the roundabout junction faster. The sound, sharp and unmistakable on a quiet Sunday afternoon, carried across to Winston Churchill Avenue. Soldiers A and B were already closing the final yards on McCann and Farrell, approaching from behind, hands moving toward the Brownings concealed under their clothing. What happened in the following seconds is simultaneously the most documented and most contested element of the entire Operation Flavius record. The soldiers gave one account, Carmen Proetta gave another. The physical evidence, specifically the positions of bullet entry wounds in 3 bodies and the location of spent cartridge cases on the petrol station forecourt, established a general picture that neither account fully contradicts and neither fully confirms. Soldier A testified at the Gibraltar inquest that Farrell glanced back over her shoulder and appeared to recognize him. He was already drawing his pistol. He said he intended to shout a challenge, but in his own testimony, events overtook the warning. McCann's right arm moved, in the soldier's words, aggressively across the front of his body. Soldier A read that movement as a man reaching for a remote detonator, a hand crossing the chest toward a jacket pocket or a belt-mounted device. He fired once into McCann's back. Farrell, in the instant after the first shot, moved her right hand toward her shoulder back. Soldier A read that too as a detonator reach. He fired once into her back as well. He then returned to McCann, who was down but still breathing, and fired 3 more times, once in the body, twice in the head. Soldier B, moving simultaneously toward his own conclusions, fired at Farrell twice, then at McCann once or twice, then came back to Farrell and fired 3 more times. 300 feet south of the petrol station, at the approach to Landport Tunnel, soldiers C and D had been moving on Savage. The distance between the 2 engagements, roughly 90 meters of pavement, meant that the sound of the shots behind them reached Savage and reached the 2 soldiers pursuing him at almost the same instant. Savage heard the shots and turned around. Soldier C shouted, "Stop!" Savage's right hand moved toward his jacket pocket. Soldier C concluded in the same fraction of a second that Soldier A had concluded that the hand was going for a detonator. He opened fire. Soldier D opened fire. Soldier C fired 6 rounds. Soldier D fired 9. The entire engagement, from the first shot fired by Soldier A to the last shot fired at Savage, took place within seconds. Every account confirms this. The specific duration cited in the brief's framing, 27 seconds, does not appear in any source that can be verified for this account. What the sources establish is that this wasn't a prolonged firefight. The 3 IRA members fired nothing. They had nothing to fire. By the time the last shot was discharged, 2 people were dead on Winston Churchill Avenue, and 1 was dying on a side street near Landport Tunnel. The soldiers put on berets immediately afterward to make themselves identifiable as military personnel. Inspector Ravagliati's patrol car, still trying to navigate through traffic on Smith Dorrien Avenue, arrived at the edge of the scene within minutes. At 16:05, 25 minutes after assuming operational control, the SAS commander handed the operation back to Gibraltar Police with a formal written document. A military assault force completed the military option in respect of the terrorist ASU in Gibraltar and returns control to the civil power. Carmen Proetta had been watching from her apartment window above the petrol station. Her account of what she saw that afternoon was the most significant civilian evidence produced by Operation Flavius. And what happened to her afterward became one of the most significant facts in its political aftermath. She told the This Week journalists in a signed affidavit before she agreed to go on camera that in the moments before McCann and Farrell were shot, she had seen 4 men, 1 in uniform and 3 in civilian clothes, jump from a police car that had stopped abruptly on Winston Churchill Avenue. The 3 plainclothes men, all carrying pistols, leapt across the central reservation. She saw McCann and Farrell raise their hands. She stated that the shooting began with the hands in the air and that a man then crouched over the bodies on the ground and continued firing. She wasn't claiming to have watched everything happen in slow motion. She was claiming that the specific sequence she observed contradicted the soldier's account of imminent threat at the moment of first fire. Her husband, Maxie, testified at the inquest that he too had seen Farrell put her hands up, though he interpreted the gesture as reflexive self-defense rather than a deliberate act of surrender. He heard the shots immediately after. Soldier A's account was that the hands were never raised. The movements he observed were reaching movements, directed toward pockets, toward a bag. He was drawing a weapon when he saw them. He fired because he believed a 64-kilogram bomb might be about to detonate in a public street. 2 accounts of the same seconds, both given under oath. The inquest had to navigate between them, without the one thing that would have resolved it conclusively: a continuous video record of the pavement in front of the Shell station between 1542 and 1545 on the 6th of March 1988. Government pathologist Professor Alan Watson of Glasgow University began giving evidence on the third day of the inquest, the 8th of September. His testimony put numbers to what had happened on the pavement. McCann had been struck 4 times. A wound to the jaw, possibly a ricochet from the pavement. A wound to the head, and 2 wounds to the back. Farrell had been struck 5 times, 2 wounds to the face and 3 to the back, with the orientation of the back wounds consistent with shots fired as she was falling or already on the ground. Watson laid out the wound pathways methodically, the careful language of a pathologist working from tissue samples, X-rays he had requested but not fully received, and a post-mortem examination he later acknowledged had been conducted under conditions he considered irregular. He had not been provided with X-ray facilities during the autopsies. Photographs had not been taken under his medical direction. Clothing had not been made available to him. He had not received the ballistics reports he had requested. When asked at the inquest about these omissions, Watson said plainly, "It's a mystery to me why this wasn't sent to me." Savage was harder to resolve precisely. Watson said he was probably struck at least 5 times in the back and at least 5 more times as he lay face up on the ground. He couldn't determine the total with certainty. The Washington Post headline the morning after Watson's testimony read, "18 bullets hit IRA man, Gibraltar inquest told." Watson's actual testimony put the figure at possibly as many as 18. He couldn't fix it further. When the family's barrister, Patrick McGrory, asked Watson whether the phrase "frenzied attack" accurately characterized what he had found in examining Savage's wounds, Watson paused briefly before answering. "I don't like using that sort of language," he said, "but it had been like a frenzied attack." The white Renault 5 was searched within hours of the shooting. No explosives, no bomb-making components, no remote detonation device was found on any of the 3 bodies. Nothing on any person that could have triggered anything. The car that had been the operational basis for the entire engagement, the car that Soldier G's assessment had converted from a possible bomb to a probable bomb, was an ordinary hire car with nothing in it. Within minutes of the shooting, the Ministry of Defence had issued a press statement saying a suspected car bomb had been found in Gibraltar. That evening, both the BBC and ITN reported a car bomb, a gun battle, and 3 dead terrorists. The BBC's Madrid correspondent had been cautious in the earliest reports, at 6:25 in the evening, noting only that troops were searching the main street following reports of a bomb, but adding that it wasn't known if that report was genuine. 3 hours later, all caution was gone. At 9 o'clock, the BBC reported 500 pounds of explosives packed inside a Renault, timed to kill troops at Tuesday's parade. ITN had further details by 9:45. 3 Irish terrorists killed in a fierce gun battle, their bomb defused by a controlled explosion. All 11 of Britain's daily newspapers ran the story the following morning, 8 of them quoting the alleged bomb at £500. The Minister of State for the Armed Forces, Ian Stewart, told BBC Radio 4 that a bomb had been found which had been defused. The Army's bomb disposal terminology does not make this claim straightforwardly false, though it's very close. In bomb disposal usage, a suspect bomb means any vehicle suspected to contain one. To deal with it means to either confirm or deny its contents through examination. The Ministry of Defence was using a technical vocabulary that neither the minister nor the journalists reporting his words appeared to understand in its precise sense. Gibraltar's official press spokesman, Ronald Sinden, was appointed that evening. He told reporters, "I am the only source of information, and I have no information." At 3:30 the following afternoon, Monday the 7th of March, Foreign Secretary Sir Geoffrey Howe rose in the House of Commons. He told Parliament the three were unarmed and the car contained no bomb. The previous reports of a £500 bomb being defused had been wrong. When challenged, the three had made movements which led the military personnel operating in support of the Gibraltar police to conclude that their own lives and the lives of others were under threat. In light of this response, they were shot. Howe then went further, insisting that a dreadful terrorist act had been prevented, that the three killed were actively involved in its planning, and that the whole House should share the sense of relief and satisfaction that it had been averted. The opposition's response from George Robertson took Howe's premise entirely at face value. Robertson congratulated the military on their well-planned operation and condemned the IRA's cynical hypocrisy in placing a bomb opposite both an old folks' home and a school. The bomb had quietly ceased to exist in the course of Howe's speech. Robertson either missed this or chose not to say so. The semantic architecture of what Howe had presented to Parliament deserves attention, because the journalist Ian Jack, who covered the inquest for Granta, made the same observation at the time. Howe was acknowledging simultaneously that there was no bomb and that a dreadful terrorist act had been prevented. Both propositions are true. The gap between them is the gap in which Operation Flavius lives. 2 days after the shooting, on Tuesday the 8th of March, Spanish police found what investigators had been looking for: a red Ford Fiesta in the Sun parking lot in the Marbella resort area, approximately 50 miles from Gibraltar. Spanish state security spokesman Agustin Valladolid confirmed to reporters that the vehicle had been left in the lot the previous Sunday, but that the timing device had not been connected and there had been no danger of an accidental detonation. Inside the car, 141 pounds of Czech-manufactured Semtex, surrounded by 200 rounds of ammunition with 4 detonators and 2 timers. The timing device was preset for 11:20 in the morning, 20 minutes after the ceremony was due to start. A set of car keys found in Farrell's handbag at the shooting scene had led investigators to the vehicle. The IRA had itself confirmed, in a statement issued on the 7th of March, that the three had had access and control over 140 pounds of explosives, attempting to correct the inflated bomb size figures in the press, while not yet understanding that no bomb had actually been found in Gibraltar. The IRA was trying to correct an exaggeration while inadvertently confirming the larger operation. The bomb was real. The attack had been planned with operational precision. But on the 6th of March 1988, when 4 SAS soldiers closed on 3 IRA members on Winston Churchill Avenue, the bomb was 50 miles away and had never entered Gibraltar. At the inquest, Mr. O, the MI5 officer who testified from behind a curtain, acknowledged what the evidence had already established. Security forces had wrongly concluded the three were carrying weapons. The car Savage had parked had been wrongly assessed as almost certainly containing a bomb. The one thing intelligence had confirmed correctly was that the three were planning an attack for the 8th. On the specific circumstances of the 6th, the picture conveyed to the soldiers had been substantially wrong on both key operational points: whether anyone was armed and whether the car was a bomb. The question the inquest couldn't answer, and that the European Court of Human Rights would later approach with careful precision, was whether anyone in the planning chain had received information before the soldiers were briefed, suggesting the Renault might be empty. The public record does not resolve this. The ECHR examined the question and reached its own limit. What it found wasn't a conspiracy to deceive the soldiers. What it found was a planning process structurally committed to one operational outcome, with no mechanism designed to detect or respond to contrary information before the engagement was triggered. 7 weeks after the shooting, on the evening of April the 28th, 1988, Thames Television broadcast a 44-minute documentary on its This Week current affairs strand. The programme was called Death on the Rock. Its editor was Roger Bolton. Its on-screen presenter was Julian Mannion. It had been in production for 6 weeks under conditions of considerable pressure, and it very nearly didn't air at all. Bolton had initially been sceptical that the story warranted investigation. Based on the official account presented in the immediate aftermath of the shooting, he believed most viewers would conclude the IRA members had gotten what they deserved. Howe's common statement changed that calculation. If the three were unarmed and the car contained no bomb, the story that had been broadcast the previous Sunday evening was substantially wrong, and the gap between what was reported and what had actually happened required investigation. Bolton dispatched Mannion to Madrid to learn more about the surveillance operation. He sent producer Chris Oxley to Gibraltar, where Oxley quickly grew concerned about the police investigation's rigour when he established that officers had not even taken statements from residents in the apartment buildings overlooking the shooting scene. The Gibraltar coroner, Felix Pizzarello, told the This Week journalists he welcomed their investigation and hoped it would uncover witnesses to assist the inquest. Bolton added journalist Alison Kahn to the team on the 18th of March with a specific task. Visit the flats overlooking Winston Churchill Avenue and knock on doors. The team also retained Lieutenant Colonel George Stiles as their technical consultant. Stiles was a decorated retired British Army bomb disposal officer who had served in Northern Ireland. He examined the car park where Savage had parked, walked the route the three had taken through town, and inspected the ricochet marks on the pump housings at the Shell station. He argued that a car carrying a bomb of the weight under discussion would likely show visible spring compression under the weight. He questioned whether a handheld radio device could reliably trigger a detonation from the shooting location, given the density of surrounding buildings and competing radio signals. These were legitimate engineering questions. They would later be disputed. A Royal Corps of Signals captain named Edwards testified at the inquest that his own technical tests showed radio transmission between the shooting location and the assembly area was entirely feasible. The technical question was never conclusively settled. While Stiles was examining the ricochet marks at the petrol station, Kahn was approached by an elderly woman in the adjacent apartment building who led her to her daughter. The daughter's name was Carmen Proeta. She was 42 years old, Spanish, and had lived in the apartment block overlooking the petrol station for years. She was initially reluctant to go on camera. She gave Kahn a signed affidavit first. Then she agreed to be filmed. Her account, once the programme aired, became the most contested piece of witness testimony in the entire Gibraltar affair. The British government tried twice to prevent Death on the Rock from being broadcast. On April the 26th, 2 days before the scheduled air date, Howe wrote to Lord Thompson, the chair of the Independent Broadcasting Authority, requesting a postponement on the grounds that the programme might prejudice the forthcoming inquest. Thompson personally watched the entire documentary before making his decision. He later wrote that, paradoxically, the decision wasn't a difficult one. His colleagues saw no reason to prevent Thames's journalists from interviewing eyewitnesses and investigating the affair, provided the criminal record of the individuals involved and the enormity of what had been planned was made clear. He permitted the broadcast with 2 minor commentary changes. On the day of the broadcast itself, Howe renewed the request, arguing this time that the programme could contaminate witness evidence. The IBA, after taking legal advice, upheld its original decision. Editing of the documentary was still being completed 10 minutes before airtime. Death on the Rock went out at 9 in the evening on ITV, on schedule, on April the 28th. Margaret Thatcher called it trial by television. The phrase was repeated across the Conservative press for weeks. Several newspapers then mounted a campaign against Carmen Proetta personally. Claims appeared in print that she was a former prostitute, that she actively campaigned for Spanish sovereignty over Gibraltar, that she was constitutionally anti-British. None of these specific claims were substantiated. Proetta brought libel actions against multiple newspapers. She won damages from Times Newspapers Limited, publisher of the Sunday Times. Thames Television commissioned an independent inquiry into the documentary, the first such inquiry into an individual programme in British broadcast history. Lord Windlesham, who had served as a minister in the Thatcher government, led it alongside barrister Richard Rampton QC. The Windlesham-Rampton report was published in January 1989. The authors criticised several specific editorial decisions. Most significantly, they pointed to the programme's use of a statement from a bank clerk named Kenneth Asquez. Asquez had described, in an unsigned affidavit provided to the programme, seeing a soldier stand over one of the fallen men and fire into the body at point-blank range with his foot on the man's throat. At the inquest, Asquez retracted the claim entirely. He testified that he had fabricated the account from news reports, motivated by a belief he might be financially rewarded. He said, under cross-examination, that he had, in fact, seen virtually nothing. The retraction was damaging to the programme's reputation on that specific point, and was the primary reason Thames had initiated the inquiry. The Windlesham-Rampton conclusion nonetheless stood. Death on the Rock was a trenchant work of journalism, made in good faith and without ulterior motives. The programme won a BAFTA. The broader account, including Proetta's testimony, wasn't discredited by Asquez's retraction. In 1991, Thames Television lost its ITV franchise in the competitive tender conducted under the Broadcasting Act 1990. The Act had introduced a cash bid system for the first time, replacing the previous qualitative evaluation process. Carlton Communications outbid Thames commercially. Several figures connected to the Death on the Rock controversy believed the franchise loss was politically motivated, a consequence of the government's sustained anger at Thames after the broadcast. The ITC's tender process didn't say so. Thames had been outbid on straightforward commercial terms, under rules that applied equally to every incumbent broadcaster. The causal connection between the documentary and the franchise decision remains contested. Thames ceased broadcasting at the end of 1992. The Coroner's Court of Gibraltar opened its inquest into the 3 deaths on the 6th of September 1988, 6 months after the shooting. Coroner Felix Pizzarello presided. The courtroom the journalists and lawyers filled had previously heard an earlier famous inquiry, the inquest into the fate of the crew of the Mary Celeste, conducted in Gibraltar after the abandoned ship was towed into port in 1872. Ian Jack, covering the inquest for Granta, noted this historical coincidence and wrote that sometimes, during those 4 weeks, it seemed as though the proceedings had generated a mystery of comparable proportions. Outside the courthouse, on the first morning, the Royal Anglian Regiment played the changing of the guard at the convent, the ceremony the IRA had planned to bomb, while journalists from dozens of countries watched from the street. Inside, the proceedings began. The SAS soldiers gave their evidence under letter designations: Soldier A, Soldier B, Soldier C, Soldier D. Their faces weren't visible to the press benches. MI5 officers testified from behind curtains. Classified intelligence assessments were withheld from the jury on national security grounds. The jury could hear most of what was presented. It couldn't hear everything. Mr. O's testimony from behind the curtain was among the most revealing moments of the 19 days. He acknowledged under cross-examination that security forces had reached wrong conclusions on both Central Intelligence questions: whether the three were carrying weapons and whether Savage's car contained a bomb. He maintained that the broader intelligence picture, the planned attack for the 8th of March, had been correctly assessed. The errors in his framing were specific to the 6th. The inquest didn't establish why. Patrick McGrory represented the families of the dead. He pressed on the ballistics. He pressed on the forensic procedure. He pressed on the gap between what Mr. O acknowledged as error and what the soldiers had been told as near certainty. Watson's pathology evidence gave him the numbers to work with. McCann struck 4 times. Farrell struck 5 times, with the final shots consistent with a target already falling. Savage struck somewhere between 16 and 18 times, including shots delivered after he was on the ground. When McGrory asked Watson whether the phrase "frenzied attack" accurately described what he had found in Savage's wounds, the exchange was careful. Watson said, "I don't like using that sort of language." Then he paused. But it had been like a frenzied attack. Carmen Proetta gave her evidence on the 14th day of the inquest, the 24th of September, and was subjected to prolonged cross-examination by Michael Hucker, the barrister representing the soldiers. He noted inconsistencies between her April television interview and her September inquest testimony, and her inability to identify military personnel from photographs she was shown. She maintained her core account, that the hands had been raised before the shots were fired, that the shooting had continued after the two were on the ground, that she had seen what she had seen from a window she had stood at for years in a building she knew intimately. Coroner Pizzarello gave the jury its instructions at the close of the proceedings. It had 2 choices: justifiable homicide, the legal term for lawful killing, or unlawful killing. There was no open verdict available. On the 30th of September 1988, after deliberation, the jury returned its verdict: lawful killing, by 9 votes to 2. 2 jurors had voted for unlawful killing. The government issued a statement of 4 words: "The verdict speaks for itself." The families of McCann, Farrell and Savage didn't agree. They had watched 19 days of proceedings in which classified intelligence had been withheld, testimony had been given anonymously, and the jury had been constrained to a binary choice. They filed an application with the European Commission of Human Rights. The case was allocated application number 18984/91. It took 4 years to reach the Grand Chamber. McCann and others versus the United Kingdom was decided on the 27th of September 1995, 7.5 years after the shooting on Winston Churchill Avenue. The Grand Chamber addressed 2 separate questions and gave them 2 separate answers. And the distance between those answers is the legal heart of everything Operation Flavius represents. The first question: did the soldiers who fired violate Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights, the right to life? The court was clear. A soldier briefed that a car nearby might contain 64 kilograms of Semtex and that one of the people he is closing on may be holding the detonation switch, can't reasonably be expected to hesitate at a movement toward a pocket. Each of the 4 soldiers had acted on the information they were given, in genuine good faith, on a threat assessment that, if accurate, would have required lethal force. The court rejected the family's case on the conduct of the individual soldiers. The trigger pullers acted lawfully. The second question: had the United Kingdom, as a state, planned and controlled the operation in a manner that met its positive obligations under Article 2 to protect the right to life? The court found against the United Kingdom. The majority was narrow. No Western democracy had previously been found in violation of Article 2 in a counter-terrorism context. This was the first. The reasoning identified 3 interlocking failures in the planning architecture. First, the decision not to arrest the 3 at the Gibraltar border or at any earlier point when the opportunity existed, combined with the specific information then passed to the soldiers, had created conditions in which lethal force was structurally inevitable. The court stated this directly. The authorities' failure to arrest the suspects at the border, combined with the information passed to the soldiers, rendered the use of lethal force almost inevitable. Second, Soldier G's professional uncertainty about the Renault had been passed to the shooting soldiers as something considerably closer to certainty, without any mechanism in the planning to detect or correct this if it proved wrong. Third, the operation had no genuine structural provision for a non-lethal outcome once the intercept phase began. Planning that reaches only one conclusion, regardless of what information arrives during execution, isn't planning for an operation. It's planning for a result. The court rejected the allegation that there had been an execution plot at the highest level of the Ministry of Defence or of government. That allegation, the judges found, was unsubstantiated. The court found no conspiracy. It found a failure of architecture. A state that had built an operational structure so committed to lethal engagement that it had foreclosed every alternative before the soldiers ever reached the pavement. No damages were awarded to the families of McCann, Farrell and Savage. The United Kingdom was ordered to pay £38,700 in the family's legal costs and expenses. No criminal prosecution was ever brought against any person involved in the planning or conduct of Operation Flavius. The UK government's public response emphasised the part of the judgment it could accept. The soldiers had been found to act lawfully. This was accurate. It wasn't the whole of what the court had said. The shooting on Winston Churchill Avenue on the 6th of March didn't end the sequence it was meant to disrupt. The 13 days that followed demonstrated this with precision. On the 16th of March, the bodies of McCann, Farrell and Savage were returned to Belfast for burial at Milltown Cemetery in the west of the city. The cortege was substantial. The press was present in numbers. During the committal service, a loyalist paramilitary named Michael Stone walked into the cemetery alone, armed with grenades and a Browning pistol. He threw grenades into the crowd gathered around the open graves and opened fire. 3 people died, including IRA member Kevin Brady. 60 more were wounded. Stone sprinted across the cemetery, pursued by the crowd, and was detained by Royal Ulster Constabulary officers before the mourners could reach him. 3 days after Milltown, on the 19th of March, 2 plainclothes British Army corporals from the Royal Corps of Signals, Derek Wood and David Howes, drove their unmarked car into the funeral cortege of Kevin Brady on the Andersonstown Road. The cortege was moving slowly through West Belfast. The car appeared without warning from a side street and drove directly into the procession. The crowd, traumatized by Stone's attack 72 hours earlier, and now conditioned to expect armed intrusion at Republican funerals, surrounded the vehicle. The corporals were dragged from the car, beaten and killed. Television camera crews and an army helicopter overhead captured portions of what happened. The footage went worldwide within hours. 6th of March to the 19th, 13 days. 3 IRA members killed by the SAS. 3 mourners killed by a loyalist at their funeral. 2 British soldiers killed by a crowd at a subsequent funeral. 8 deaths in a sequence where each event had generated the preconditions for the next. The operation that was designed to prevent a catastrophic bombing in Gibraltar produced, in the weeks surrounding it, a different kind of catastrophe, cascading through the streets of West Belfast in ways the Gibraltar planners had not modelled and couldn't have easily contained. The legal architecture the ECHR constructed in September 1995 didn't prevent future controversial killings. It created the framework against which they had to be answered. The planning failure doctrine, requiring states to demonstrate genuine structural provision for non-lethal outcomes throughout an operation rather than merely at the moment of discharge, would be invoked in every subsequent contested counter-terrorism killing in Western Europe. 17 years later, in July 2005, Metropolitan Police officers shot Jean-Charles de Menezes 7 times in the head on an underground train at Stockwell Station in London. He was a Brazilian electrician on his way to work, wrongly identified as a suspect in the previous day's failed bombings. The investigation and subsequent legal proceedings operated on exactly the terrain the ECHR had mapped in 1995. Not whether the officers who fired had acted on genuine belief, but whether the state had planned the operation with adequate protection for an innocent life built into its structure from the start. No officers were convicted. The institutional finding on planning fell once again on the organisation above the trigger. The shadow cast by those seconds on Winston Churchill Avenue extended a long way. Mairead Farrell was born in Belfast in 1957. She joined the IRA as a teenager, was convicted on bombing charges in April 1976 at 19, and was sentenced to 14 years in Armagh jail. In Armagh, she became the officer commanding of the IRA women's prisoners, organising protests, refusing prison uniforms, directing the emptying of chamber pots onto cell floors when bathroom facilities were denied, and leading an 18-day hunger strike against the withdrawal of political prisoner status. She was, by any account, a committed and capable person, who had channeled her capabilities into an organisation that killed civilians and soldiers without remorse. She was also a human being who spent 10 years in a prison before being released in 1986, attending university and then returning to the IRA, because, by her own account, she couldn't remain on the sidelines of the struggle. She was the only female member of the Provisional Irish Republican Army ever killed by British Special Forces. She was 30 years old when she died on the pavement outside a petrol station on Winston Churchill Avenue. 10 years of those 30 spent in Armagh jail, a third of her life behind those walls. She had been free for 18 months. The British state, by its own account and the account of the court in Strasbourg, had been working to stop her for a decade. First, lawfully, through imprisonment. Then, through an operation whose planning the European Court of Human Rights took 4 years to examine. The court ruled the planning was wrong. No one was ever charged. The pavement on Winston Churchill Avenue is still there. Subscribe for more stories like this.